When people ask me when it began, I always want to tell them that it did not begin with a single revelation, or a secret box in the back of a closet, or even the first time my wife held my hand and called me by the name I had once only whispered to myself. It began so much earlier than that, so early that memory and feeling are tangled together now, like threads in a blanket that has been washed so many times the pattern has softened, but the warmth remains. It began in a little house with a narrow hallway and squeaking floors, in the years when my world was made of ordinary things. The smell of detergent on clean towels, the clatter of dishes after dinner, cartoons on a Saturday morning, my mother humming while she brushed my sister's hair, my father clearing his throat before saying something important. It began before I had language for any of it. I only had sensations then, small and wordless, the sense that I was always standing half a step outside the person everyone else thought I was, trying to smile at the right times and answer to the right name, and settle into a role that never quite stopped itching against the skin of my life. I was a quiet child, the kind adults called thoughtful because they did not know what else to call a child who watched more than he spoke. My older brother was loud and easy in the world. He took up space naturally. He crashed toy trucks into furniture, asked for seconds at dinner, interrupted people, got muddy, got angry, got over it. My younger sister moved differently from both of us. Even when she was small, she seemed to understand some secret grammar of softness and social ease. She leaned into our mother when she was tired, knew how to receive compliments without becoming stiff, knew how to hold a teacup from the toy set our grandmother gave her and make it seem graceful instead of like a prop. I loved being around her and envied her in a way I could not have explained. At the time, I would not have called it envy. I would only have said that I liked being in her room because it felt calm there, because the colors were gentler, because the whole space seemed to permit a kind of feeling that the rest of the house did not. Some of my earliest memories are of sitting on the carpet outside my mother's bedroom while she got ready to go somewhere. She would sit at her vanity or stand in front of the mirror by the closet, and the room would fill with the powdery smell of face cream and the dry click of bracelets touching as she reached for earrings. I loved the sequence of it. I loved how getting dressed for her seemed to mean becoming more fully visible instead of less. My father dressed for work too, of course, but his ritual always felt like armor. Belt, watch, shoes, keys, briefcase done. My mother's ritual felt expressive. There was a tenderness to it, an attentiveness. She would study herself not with vanity, at least not the shallow kind, but with care, as if she were asking, who am I today, and how do I want to appear in the world? I used to sit very still and watch, full of a longing so quiet I barely noticed it. I did not want to possess her things. I wanted whatever door they opened for her. Children reach for symbols before they understand meaning, and I was no different. I wrapped towels around my head after baths and stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, looking not ridiculous to myself, but strangely relieved. I liked the swing of oversized shirts around my legs. I liked softness in fabric. I liked being mistaken, once or twice, from behind or in half-light, before someone laughed and corrected themselves. Those moments embarrassed me and thrilled me so quickly that the feelings fused together. There was never anything dramatic in it. No one caught me in some scandalous tableau. I was not living in a story then, only in a childhood. But I remember the first time shame entered the room. I was maybe 7, playing at my aunt's house with a pile of old costumes my cousins kept in a trunk. There were capes and plastic crowns and cheap beads, and a faded dress from some school play. I had reached for it without thinking, the way one reaches for a color one likes. My cousin laughed, not cruelly, just with the bright thoughtlessness of children, and said, "That one's for girls." My hand jerked back as if the fabric had burned me. What stayed with me was not her laughter, but how quickly I learned. Not what I was, not yet, but what I was not supposed to reveal. After that, I became careful in the way some children become quiet after hearing adults argue through a thin wall. I still drifted toward what felt natural to me, but I learned to do it invisibly. I learned that there were ways of loving beauty that were permitted and ways that were suspect, and I did not know which category I belonged in, only that I had better study the rules. Family life trained me in that study. My father was not a monster. That is important to say. He worked hard, came home tired, coached my brother's Little League team, carried sleeping children from the car after long evenings at relatives' houses. He loved us in the language he had inherited, which was practical and stern and sometimes tender only when no one seemed to be looking. But he believed deeply in the categories that had organized his own life. Boys were boys. Girls were girls. Men were steady. Women were nurturing. A son should learn firmness and restraint. A son should not cry over small things. A son should not fuss over clothes. A son should stand up straight, shake hands properly, stop hovering in the kitchen when the men were outside. I do not remember him giving a speech about any of this. He did not need to. In families, ideology often arrives disguised as routine. My mother was harder to read because she was both gentler and more complicated. She noticed more than my father did, I think. She once found me smoothing the skirt of one of my sister's dolls and asked, very softly, "What are you doing, sweetheart?" There was no accusation in her voice, which almost made it worse, because I had no defense prepared against kindness. I shrugged and said I was just fixing it. She looked at me a moment too long, then said, "All right," and walked away. I spent the rest of the day certain she knew everything, though I myself did not know what everything was. Looking back, I wonder if she was trying to give me space, or if she sensed a question in me and had no idea how to ask it without changing our lives. Parents often seem omniscient to children, but adulthood taught me how much parenting is guesswork dressed as certainty. School sharpened all the feelings I had been trying to blur. Childhood play gives way, slowly and then all at once, to social sorting. Boys grouped themselves by ease with roughness, competition, volume. Girls grouped themselves by intimacies I watched from a distance with an ache that embarrassed me. I did not want to date them or impress them or conquer their attention the way boys around me eventually seemed expected to do. I wanted to belong beside them in the casual democracy of shared secrets and softened voices and mutual observation. I listened when they talked about who was kind and who was fake and whose mother let them paint their nails on weekends. I noticed the choreography of friendship among them, the shoulder touches, the unguarded laughter, the permission to care about appearance without apology. If I stood too close, I worried I was intruding. If I stayed too far back, I felt lonely in a way that did not resemble ordinary loneliness. It felt like exile from a country I could see, but had no passport for. My brother became popular in the easy masculine way I had once hoped might rub off on me. He could turn almost anything into a joke. Teachers rolled their eyes at him and forgave him. Coaches barked at him and then clapped him on the back. He seemed to know, instinctively, how to inhabit boyhood without thinking about it. My relationship with him was affectionate, but strained by comparison. He did not bully me. He simply did not understand me. He would ask why I cared so much whether a shirt felt scratchy, why I hated getting my hair cut, why I never wanted to go hunting with our uncles, why I always volunteered to help our mother and grandmother in the kitchen during holidays. "You're weird," he said to me more than once, but with a kind of brotherly impatience rather than true cruelty. It still landed like a verdict. In families, even mild judgments collect interest over time. By the time I reached adolescence, the distance between my inner life and my outer role had begun to frighten me. Childhood can absorb contradiction because everything still feels provisional. Adolescence makes every difference feel permanent. I watched my peers become more themselves, or at least more confidently performative versions of themselves, while I felt like I was being sealed into an identity that hardened each year. The changes in my body did not feel like milestones. They felt like doors shutting. My face, my voice, my posture, the way adults began to address me, the expectations that gathered around me like heavy coats I could not take off, all of it filled me with a low, persistent grief I could not name. I did not have the language of gender dysphoria then. I had the language of disappointment, anxiety, awkwardness, self-consciousness, inadequacy. I thought perhaps I was simply failing at being a person in the ordinary way teenagers imagine their pain is unique and untranslatable. I tried, of course. That may be what hurts most to remember, how sincerely I tried. I studied boys. I adjusted my laugh. I learned to answer teasing with self-deprecation. I allowed friends to drag me into styles that felt like uniforms from a nation at war with tenderness. I accepted my father's praise when I looked like a young man. It never felt good, but I learned to accept it with a nod because rejecting praise is its own kind of visibility. Inside, though, I had begun to keep a second ledger of moments that seemed trivial to anyone else and enormous to me. The first time a classmate said I had nice eyelashes, and I carried the compliment for weeks. The afternoon I stayed home sick and wandered into my mother's room and held one of her cardigans against myself, not for excitement but for relief. The embarrassment I felt when family friends said I would be such a handsome husband someday, as if they were prophesying a role in which I could imagine competence, but not peace. The strange comfort I found in books told from women's perspectives because the emotional textures felt closer to home even when the circumstances did not. I wish I could say I discovered the truth about myself in one luminous instant, but that would flatten the reality. The reality was slower, lonelier, and far more ordinary. It grew in me the way dawn grows in a room while you are still half asleep. In high school and college, the internet became both a refuge and a terror. I found stories, scattered and anonymous, written by people whose feelings resembled mine closely enough to make my hands shake. At first, I searched indirectly, as if I were afraid the computer itself might judge me. Why do some boys like girls' clothes? Feeling like a girl sometimes. Can someone be normal and still wish they were born female? Those words look so fragile to me now, so clearly written by someone pleading with the dark. I read personal essays, forum posts, transition timelines, confessions. Some frightened me because they seemed too certain, too dramatic, too unlike the gray inwardness of my own life. Some comforted me because they described not grand revelations, but years of confusion, compromise, repression, and eventual honesty. Still, even then, I kept telling myself I was only curious. Curiosity is the name many of us give our truth before we can bear its real name. College gave me distance from my family, but distance is not the same as freedom. You can move away from a script and still hear it in your own voice. I had more privacy then, which meant more opportunities to try on pieces of myself in secret and more opportunities to hate myself for needing secrecy at all. I bought simple things first, items bland enough to hide and gentle enough to soothe me. A soft top, a cardigan, sleep shorts that felt neutral if anyone found them, but different to me. I would put them on in my dorm room late at night or in an apartment bathroom after roommates had gone out, and the feeling was never the lurid thrill that outsiders often imagine. It was closer to exhaling after holding my breath too long. The mirror did not suddenly reveal some finished, radiant woman. Usually it revealed a frightened, awkward young person with tender eyes and too much self-consciousness, someone caught between recognition and disbelief. But even those imperfect moments gave me something I could not unlearn. I felt more emotionally coherent that way, more visible to myself, more sad, sometimes, because I could sense what I wanted and how far away it seemed, but also more real. I dated a little in college, mostly because I thought perhaps intimacy with a woman would resolve the confusion by assigning me a place in relation to someone else. It did not work that way. I cared for the women I dated, but always with a faint sense that I was imitating the version of boyfriends I had seen in movies or in the lives of other men. I knew how to listen. I knew how to be loyal. I knew how to bring soup when someone was sick, remember details, write thoughtful messages, notice if a tone had shifted in the middle of a conversation. Some women appreciated those things. Some wanted a stronger performance of masculinity than I could convincingly offer. None of them knew what was really wrong, because I barely knew it myself. I would lie awake after dates, not thinking about conquest or chemistry, but about the strange sadness of being seen as something I could perform but not inhabit. Then I met the woman who became my wife, and with her my life began, very slowly, to tell the truth. I met her in the least cinematic way possible, through ordinary overlap, ordinary repetition. A friend of a friend at first, then a regular presence in a group that kept finding reasons to gather. She laughed with her whole face. She listened with the kind of attention that made people become more articulate around her. She did not rush to fill silence, which meant I sometimes did. What I loved first was not how she looked, though she was beautiful, but how safe I felt near her. Safety is not a glamorous beginning, but it is an underrated one. She had a steadiness to her, a way of reacting that made me believe nothing in me would shock her into cruelty. I did not yet know how much that mattered. We became friends before we became anything else, and friendship gave me my first real taste of being loved for the aspects of myself that had always seemed least masculine. She liked that I noticed things. She liked that I remembered what she had said 3 weeks ago. She liked that I knew how to comfort without trying to fix. Once, after I helped her prepare for a stressful family event by listening to her rehearse boundaries she wanted to hold, she said, "You make things feel gentler." I remember going home and crying, not because the comment was sad, but because it named something in me I had always been afraid was weakness. In her mouth, it sounded like value. When we started dating, I did what I had always done. I loved sincerely while hiding the fault line running through me. I told myself I would figure it out first. I told myself it might fade. I told myself loving her would simplify me. Instead, love made dishonesty feel heavier. The closer we became, the more painful it was to know there was a room inside me I kept locked. Marriage did not create that pain, but it made it impossible to ignore. By then, I had built a functional adult life. I had a job, a schedule, shared bills, family holidays to attend as a couple, neighbors who knew us, photographs on walls, routine. From the outside, I looked like a man settling comfortably into adulthood. From the inside, I felt increasingly like a translator who had spent so long speaking for someone else that I was losing fluency in my own language. Domestic life with my wife was both joyful and unbearable in its own way because it showed me, every day, how much intimacy I was still withholding. We built habits together. Grocery lists on the fridge. Coffee on Sunday mornings. Laundry folded while half-watching some show we both liked. Small disagreements about clutter and thermostat settings and whose turn it was to call a plumber. In the middle of all that ordinary love, my private questions grew sharper. Sometimes it was sparked by nothing more than seeing her get ready in the morning the way my mother once had. Not because I wished to replace her, but because the whole realm of feminine selfhood still called to me with the ache of home. Sometimes it was sparked by being referred to as her husband in public and feeling a strange dual reaction. Pride in belonging to her, grief at the shape that belonging took. Sometimes I would borrow the language of stress or insecurity to explain my moods when what I really meant was, I do not know how much longer I can survive being misnamed by my own life. The first time she came close to the truth, it was because I had become careless with sadness. I think secrecy always imagines itself as a matter of facts, but often it is betrayed by atmosphere first. She noticed the heaviness in me before she noticed any evidence. One evening we were sitting in the living room after dinner, both too tired to do anything productive, and she muted the television and asked, "Are you unhappy with me?" The question pierced me because it exposed the cost of my silence. I turned immediately toward reassurance, toward telling her she had done nothing wrong, but something in my voice must have cracked. She watched me for a long time and then said, softer, "Then what is hurting you?" I wanted in that instant both to confess everything and to flee the house. Instead, I said I did not know how to explain it, which was true, but not complete. It took months after that before I said anything clear. I wish I had been brave sooner. Instead, I was halting, indirect, and often maddeningly vague. I talked about feeling disconnected from myself, about having had strange feelings since childhood, about sometimes imagining life differently and then hating myself for it. She listened, asked careful questions, and did not force a conclusion. That patience probably saved me. If she had demanded immediate clarity, I might have retreated. There are truths that only emerge when they're no longer being chased. One night, after a silence so long I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, I said, "Sometimes I think I was supposed to be a woman." Even now, I remember the terror of those words leaving my mouth. I had imagined that saying them aloud would shatter something beyond repair. Instead, the room stayed intact. My wife took a breath and then another and said, "Have you been carrying that alone all this time?" I nodded, and she started crying before I did. People hear that and imagine instant resolution, but real love is rarely that tidy. Her compassion did not erase her confusion. My honesty did not immediately produce understanding. There were weeks after that conversation when we were both gentle and raw. She asked what it meant. I said I did not know. She asked if I wanted to transition. I said I was afraid to want anything. She asked whether I was unhappy being married to her. I said no so quickly it startled us both, because that answer was the clearest truth I had. I loved her. I wanted our life. I simply could not keep amputating myself to fit inside it. She told me she needed time, which I respected. I told her I understood if she was scared, which I did. We were both grieving the certainty we thought we had, even as a deeper honesty began to make room for something sturdier than certainty. What changed everything was not one dramatic conversation, but the slow accumulation of smaller ones.
On drives.
In bed with the lights off. While washing dishes. During walks around the block when speaking face-to-face felt too exposing. She asked about my childhood, and I told her stories I had never told anyone. The towel wrapped around my head, the costumes at my aunt's house, the longing in my mother's room, the quiet envy of my sister's ease. She asked how long I had felt relief when I wore softer clothes, and I told her the truth, so long that I could not remember the beginning of it. She asked what frightened me most. I said losing her, disappointing my parents, becoming a spectacle, making a mistake, discovering I was too late, discovering I was not brave enough, discovering that honesty would cost more than I could pay. She would hold my hand and listen without trying to reduce any of it. That hand-holding became its own language. Sometimes love is not the right answer spoken at the right moment. Sometimes it is a warm palm remaining steady while another person trembles. The first tangible change between us came when she asked if I wanted to show her the clothes I had hidden away. I had kept them in a nondescript box for years, buried under things I hoped no one would ever bother moving. Bringing them out felt humiliating, not because there was anything shameful in them, but because they were artifacts of such lonely secrecy. The items themselves were simple, chosen more for comfort than style, and seeing them in the light of our shared bedroom made me feel young in the worst way, like a child caught preserving scraps of a dream. My wife touched the fabric with such tenderness that I nearly sobbed. She did not laugh. She did not flinch. She simply asked if wearing them helped me feel more like myself. I said yes. She nodded, as if that answer mattered more than any category. Later that night, when I emerged from the bathroom after changing, I could hardly look at her. She looked at me calmly, kindly, and said, "You seem less far away." No compliment anyone had ever given me had reached deeper. From there the changes were still small. A face wash I liked. Better skincare because, as she said with a half smile, everyone deserves to feel cared for by their own routine. Letting my hair grow a little longer. Choosing softer colors when we shopped for clothes nobody else would think twice about. Sitting together one evening while she showed me how she shaped her brows, not as a makeover montage, but as a quiet act of inclusion. I was astonished by how emotional these ordinary lessons made me. Each one said, without grand declarations, "There is room for you here. There is room for the version of you who has been waiting." I did not suddenly become confident. If anything, the early stages of honesty made me more fragile. Once you stop denying your own pain, you feel it more clearly. There were days I looked in the mirror and saw possibility, and days I saw only loss. There were days I told myself I could keep everything contained to private spaces, that maybe I only needed these small permissions. Then someone at work would slap my shoulder and call me man, or a cashier would say sir, or a relative would praise me in some masculine role, and the old sadness would come rushing back with new sharpness because now I knew what it was. Naming a wound does not heal it. Sometimes it only teaches you where not to press. Telling my wife, I thought I might be more than a man who liked certain clothes took longer than telling her the first part. I worried that each new layer of truth would feel to her like deception. But repression is not the same as lying. It took me years to understand that. One evening, after a family gathering where I had spent hours performing a version of myself so familiar I could practically do it in my sleep, I came home exhausted and sat on the edge of our bed with tears I could not stop. My wife knelt in front of me and asked what the evening had felt like. I said, like being invited to my own impersonation. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if taking that in physically. Then she asked, very quietly, "When you imagine peace, are you imagining living as a woman?" I had never heard anyone speak the question so plainly. I nodded before fear could interrupt me. That was one of the first times I let myself understand that my longing was not only about clothes or softness or escape. It was about identity, about recognition, about the unbearable effort of inhabiting a role that was adjacent to me, but not mine. Therapy helped, though not because some therapist told me who I was. It helped because I finally had a place where I could speak in complete sentences about feelings I had spent decades abbreviating. I talked about childhood, shame, family expectations, marriage, fear, grief, hope. I talked about how ridiculous I felt using words like woman for myself, and how relieved I felt when I let those words sit in the room anyway. My wife came with me to a few sessions, and hearing her speak about her own process humbled me. She did not present herself as a saint. She spoke honestly about mourning assumptions, about being scared of social consequences, about wondering what our relationship would look like, about wanting my truth and still being afraid of change. Her honesty made me trust her even more. Support that pretends complexity does not exist is brittle. Her support had roots because it grew through complexity, not around it. Coming out to family happened in stages and never all at once. First, my sister, because she had become in adulthood exactly what she seemed poised to become in childhood: perceptive, loving, and impossible to fool for long. We met for coffee, and I stumbled through an explanation that sounded tinny to my own ears. She listened without interrupting, then reached across the table and squeezed my hand so hard it almost hurt. "I think," she said, her eyes wet, "that part of me has always known you were carrying something lonely." It was not that she had secretly identified me as trans from childhood. It was that she had sensed my distance from boyhood, my constant self-editing, my tenderness with no safe place to land. She asked what name I was thinking about, whether I wanted her to use it, whether she could help tell our mother when I was ready. I walked out of that cafe feeling lighter than I had in years. My mother cried when I told her, but they were not the tears I had feared. There was sadness in them, yes, and confusion, and the unmistakable grief of a parent realizing that a child has suffered in silence for longer than she knew. "I wish you had told me sooner," she kept saying, which pierced me because it implied a world where I might have. I told her I had not known how. She said she understood, though I do not think understanding is ever instant. She asked clumsy questions and then apologized for them. She admitted she worried for me. She worried what people would say. She worried whether I would be safe. She worried whether she had missed signs she should have seen. I told her the truth. The signs had been there, but they had looked like ordinary moments because that is what most truth looks like while it is still growing. My father was harder. He was not cruel, but he was wounded in the way people are wounded when reality refuses the shape they had assigned it. He wanted explanations that sounded factual rather than emotional. He asked if I was sure. He asked why now. He asked whether this had something to do with the internet, with modern culture, with therapy, with dissatisfaction, with depression. Beneath all those questions, I heard the one he could not ask cleanly. Did I fail at teaching you how to be a man? I wanted to tell him that the question itself was the problem, that I had never been his failed son so much as his unseen daughter, but I did not yet have the courage. So I said only that this was not about failure. It was about truth. Extended family reacted as families do, in a mixture of grace, awkwardness, distance, and surprising tenderness. An aunt I expected to be difficult sent me a handwritten note that simply said she loved me and was trying. A cousin avoided me for months and then reappeared with careful politeness, which I accepted as a beginning. My brother struggled in the blunt, defensive way I had anticipated, making jokes that died quickly when nobody joined in, insisting he did not care, while clearly caring very much. But even he changed over time. I think he had to mourn not the loss of a brother exactly, but the loss of an easy script. Once, much later, he admitted that growing up he had always sensed I was suffering but assumed I was just sensitive in a way he did not know how to help. That confession softened something between us. We both had childhoods we had not known how to interpret. The social transition itself was quieter than outsiders imagine and more emotionally seismic than it looked. So much of it involved paperwork, practice, corrections, waiting rooms, introductions, awkward conversations, trying on names until one stopped feeling like borrowed clothing and started feeling like skin. But beneath those practicalities was a profound internal weather shift. Each step carried both relief and terror. The first time my wife used my chosen name at home, casually, while asking if I wanted tea, I had to turn away because the tenderness of it was almost unbearable. The first time she introduced me that way to someone else, my heart pounded so hard I could barely hear the rest of the conversation. The first time I left the house dressed in a way that matched my inner sense of self more closely, it was not glamorous. I was sure everyone was staring. I was sure I looked uncertain because I was uncertain. My wife noticed my breathing had gone shallow and threaded her fingers through mine. "You do not have to become anyone tonight," she whispered. "You only have to stop hiding." That sentence carried me through more than one doorway. What surprised me most was how ordinary joy could be when it was finally allowed. The right sweater. A haircut that felt like recognition instead of compromise. Learning, slowly, what presentation made me feel grounded rather than performative. Discovering that femininity was not a costume I had to master, but a language with many dialects, one of which could be mine. I had feared, for years, that if I ever allowed myself to live openly, I would have to become theatrical, hyper-visible, endlessly explanatory. Instead, I found myself drawn to simple things. Softness. Coherence. The pleasure of looking in the mirror and not flinching as often. The pleasure of being addressed in a way that did not scrape against me. The pleasure of no longer feeling split in two at breakfast. There were painful moments too, more than I like to remember. Strangers can be cruel without even trying, and institutions often lag behind the human beings moving through them. There were forms with no room for nuance, relatives who weaponized nostalgia. Acquaintances who treated my transition like a debate prompt, old friends who vanished because my truth made them uncomfortable. There were mornings I questioned everything, not because I stopped being myself, but because being myself demanded so much stamina. On those mornings, my wife never tried to solve me. She would sit beside me and say things like, "You are still here," or "You do not owe anyone an easier version of your life," or "Most precious of all, I can see you." To be seen is one thing. To be seen by the person who loved you before you could see yourself clearly and who stayed through the clarifying is another thing entirely. The title I carry in my own heart for those years is not transformation in the dramatic sense. It is emergence. I did not become a different soul. I became less divided. The person my wife married was not a lie. She was a truth buried under fear, trying desperately to be lovable in the only form she believed available. When I grieve the years before I knew how to say my own name, I try not to do so with contempt. That younger self survived by adapting. She learned invisibility because visibility seemed impossible. She learned to translate herself into acceptable terms. She learned to make a life while carrying a quiet ache. I honor her now. I do not mock her caution. She got me here. And my wife, my dear wife, held my hand through more of that emergence than anyone will ever fully understand. She held it in therapist waiting rooms. In department stores where I was afraid to touch anything I actually liked. In parking lots after family events that left me scraped raw. In the kitchen when I practiced hearing my own name out loud. On the couch when I told her I felt foolish and old and too late, and she answered that becoming oneself is not a race. She held it the day I updated documents that made my life legible to the world in a new way. She held it when I cried over what looked, from a distance, like tiny victories. She held it when I doubted whether I deserved this life. Her hand became the bridge between the person I had been performing and the woman I had always been becoming. Years have passed now, enough that some of the old panic has settled into memory rather than weather. I still remember it with startling clarity sometimes. The little boy in the hallway outside his mother's room, the teenager shrinking from praise that named the wrong future, The young husband sitting beside a loving woman and fearing that honesty might destroy the only home he had ever made for himself. I want to reach back through time and tell all those versions of me that nothing about them was grotesque or trivial or shameful. I want to tell them that confusion is not failure, that longing has information in it, that envy can be a compass, that tenderness is not weakness, that the life waiting on the other side of honesty is not perfect but breathable. Most of all, I want to tell them that they will not walk into it alone. If my story has any shape at all, it is the shape of a hand being taken and not released. My mother's, in early childhood, teaching care, without knowing what it would mean to me. My sister's, across a cafe table, studying the truth when I finally spoke it. Even in a more difficult way, my own hand, learning not to recoil from itself. But above all, my wife's hand, warm around mine when I was still shaking, guiding me not toward some fantasy version of womanhood, but toward the simple, radical act of no longer abandoning myself. There was no sudden magic in it, no cinematic unveiling, only one small, honest moment after another, one conversation after another, one ordinary day after another in which fear loosened slightly and recognition deepened. I became who I always was in increments so modest that, from the outside, they might have looked like nothing at all. A different shirt, a longer pause before answering to the wrong name, a truer smile in photographs, less distance in my eyes, more ease in my shoulders. But from the inside it felt like the slow return of oxygen. I live now with the quiet amazement of someone who spent years believing peace belonged to other people. I still have hard days. I still carry scars from the long apprenticeship in self-erasure. Family remains family, meaning loving and imperfect and occasionally painful. The world remains uneven in its kindness. But when I think of my life now, what overwhelms me is not bitterness. It is gratitude so deep it sometimes startles me. Gratitude that truth survived in me despite everything. Gratitude that love found me in a form strong enough to hold complexity. Gratitude that the little child watching women move through the world with wonder did not lose that wonder completely. Gratitude that the person looking back now can finally say she and me, not an aspiration, not a disguise, not a dream, but a fact as gentle and solid as breathing. I did not become someone else. I became visible to myself. And because my wife held my hand while I crossed that trembling distance, the memory of fear no longer defines the story. What defines it, in the end, is the impossible tenderness of being met there and loved enough to keep going.